Today I'm going to address questions like the following. So, what is morally wrong with blasphemy? Is blasphemy morally significant at all? Or is it just a matter of religious orthodoxy or heresy? These are some of the questions I'm going to address. I will not investigate one particular example of blasphemy, but rather mention or name some cases every now and then in the course of my lecture. These are recent acts like, for example, pop singer Madonna's crucifixion act on stage, or, of course, the Mohammed cartoons that were published first by a Danish newspaper in 2005. All of you should have a handout with sort of keywords concerning the lecture. To start off, I will address the most important concepts which I need to investigate the topic, especially what it means to be morally wrong and what precisely do we mean when I talk about blasphemy. Subsequently, I will delineate and examine three important arguments whether blasphemy is morally wrong. The first is what I call the argument from blasphemy. This is very brief. Second, more interestingly, the argument from offense, and thirdly, the argument from exclusion. And finally, I'm going to say something about the scope, of the appropriate scope of an ethical analysis of blasphemous acts. So first, terminological clarifications. I will focus in this paper on the contemporary context of democratic and pluralistic societies. So societies like the Netherlands, for example. This is important for this first conceptual issue, namely what it means to be morally wrong. Always when you investigate a sort of action, whether it is morally wrong or not, you need a particular criterion or a moral principle. Yeah? For example, if you say, okay, it's morally wrong to take a book from the library and not to return it, you presuppose a claim of the library to get the book returned, or you presuppose the norm that it's morally wrong to steal the book from the library. I will not take one specific moral principle or moral claim as criterion or as a normative point of reference for my analysis. Rather, I want to take a rather fuzzy approach, fuzzy understanding of morally wrong as starting point of my analysis. And according to this understanding, an action is morally wrong if it violates a valid moral claim. Yeah? So there are different possibilities of such a moral claim, and this is what I'm going to investigate. There is, however, one common feature of a valid moral claim, which I presuppose in the following. I will work on the assumption that a valid moral claim needs to be justified by reasons the normative force of which is independent on particular religious beliefs. Yeah, so this is because of the context of pluralistic societies. A normative theory which is supposed to be applied there should be justifiable according to reasons that are independent from particular religious beliefs. A claim cannot be considered a valid moral claim, therefore, if it can only be justified by reference to specific religious beliefs, for example, about certain attributes of God, or by referring to Holy Scripture or pronouncement of religious dignitaries. So the second conceptual issue concerns the notion of blasphemy. What does blasphemy mean? A rather general definition of blasphemy that could be acceptable at least to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. This understands blasphemy as the desecration of God and His honor in word and deed. This, however, is quite a general and not very specific definition. More specific, and within the Christian tradition, quite influential definition was provided by the scholastic theologian Alexander of Hales, who lived in the 12th and 13th century. According to his definition of blasphemy, blasphemy is a sort of threefold phenomenon involving either attributing to God a characteristic He does not have, or denying that He has a quality that He does possess, or attributing to a creature an attribute that is unique to God. For example, if I claim that I am almighty or omnipotent, this might be considered blasphemous according to this definition, since this is an attribute that is unique to God but not to human beings. I will come back to this definition later, but what is evident here is that according to such an understanding of blasphemy, the immediate object or potential victim of blasphemy is simply God himself, right? Yeah. So if we understand blasphemy in a somehow broader sense, the object of blasphemy can also be somebody or something who is considered sacred or especially venerable, like, for example, Jesus, Mohammed, or Holy Scriptures. A still broader understanding of blasphemy includes the vilification or ridicule of religious dignitaries, religious beliefs, or religious practices. At first glance, we could say, okay, this is an adequate understanding of blasphemy for the discussion of conflicts like, for example, the Mohammed controversy. Yeah? There are depictions of a person who is considered especially venerable, and therefore this is blasphemous. Or more or less the same applies to Madonna's crucifixion act on stage. There is, however, a major problem with such a definition. If we conceptualize blasphemy in terms of the desecration of God or persons or things considered sacred, then the question whether blasphemy is morally wrong is more or less settled from the outset and has to be answered negatively. Yeah? This is evident if we come back to the definition of Alexander of Hales. They claim that an utterance attributes to God a particular characteristic he does not have, presupposes particular beliefs concerning God, a particular image of God, yeah, including certain attributes this God does have or does not have. And this, of course, is not possible within the normative framework of my analysis, since I said there needs to be a moral claim which is independent on particular religious beliefs. So against this background, I'm proposing not to use the concept of blasphemy at all in ethical analysis of cases like the Mohammed cartoons or Madonna's crucifixion act. Because the term blasphemy cannot, and in my view, should not be freed from its dependency on particular religious beliefs. The concept of blasphemy is simply not apt to approach the acts of expression I'm interested in from an ethical point of view. So what I'm saying is not that blasphemy is morally unproblematic or so, but I'm rather supposing that the argument from blasphemy, this is the argument for blasphemy, is not an ethical argument, more or less. Yeah? So it's not morally significant if we presuppose a definition like the one which I provided here. This, however, cannot be the final conclusion, of course, of an ethical analysis of blasphemous acts. Rather, it's necessary to take the perspective of believers into account as well. And this is what I'm doing in the following. Many protesters against, for example, these Mohammed cartoons did not only claim that Mohammed was denigrated or desecrated here, but they claimed that they themselves, the believers, were affected by the publication of these cartoons. Among the complaints against such acts is very often the claim that such acts or such utterances offend religious sensibilities of the faithful. Against this background, I want to consider now what I call the argument from offense. And this argument states that an act is immorally wrong because it is religiously offensive. But to simplify matters, I will continue to use the term blasphemy, you know, and just to denote such acts. According to this argument from offense, an act can be morally wrong because it offends the religious sensibilities of believers. What does this precisely mean? First we have to ask, what does it mean? What does it mean to be offensive, or what does it mean to offend somebody? Very often, or almost always, the point of reference of the discussion here is Joel Feinberg's book on offense to others from 1985, as far as I know. So Feinberg defines to offend as to cause another person to experience a mental state of a universally disliked kind. A mental state of a universally disliked kinds, for example, disgust, shame, hurt, or anxiety. So if I'm causing somebody to experience such an emotion, then I'm offending this person. For an action to be offensive in a morally significant way, however, a person must not only suffer such a disliked kind of emotion, but also attribute his or her suffering to the conduct of another person, and furthermore, he or she must resent the other person for his or her role in causing the disliked mental state. Yeah? We can imagine a morally insignificant form of offense. For example, disgust that somebody feels in view of the wounds of an injured person. Yeah? So I'm feeling a sort of disliked kind of mental state, but the wounded person would probably not be resented for being the cause of my disliked mental state, and therefore this kind of offense is, according to Feinberg, not morally significant. So it's even not a candidate for being morally wrong. In an examination of this argument from offense, it can be certainly assumed, in my view, that many believers have been suffering disliked emotions like anger, hurt, disgust, when being confronted with, for example, these depictions of Muhammad. Hence we can say, okay, they experience offense. Furthermore, the protests show that believers attributed their suffering to particular conduct of persons, namely to the illustrators or to the editors of Julian's Post, other newspapers. Finally, it can be taken for granted, in my view, that many believers resented the illustrators and the editors for having drawn and published such depictions of Muhammad. And a brief analysis of the protest, of course, shows this. It can be said, therefore, that blasphemy, or a religiously offensive act, is to be considered morally significant. Yeah? So this is a sort of first result. But is it morally wrong? Within the normative framework of my analysis, I have to investigate now whether there is a moral claim not to be offended in one's religious sensibilities. There are reasons, in my view, there are reasons not to consider such a claim unreasonable from the outset. I pointed out earlier that the immediate victim of blasphemy is God or Jesus Christ or so, and this is different according to this argument. Yeah? We don't need a particular religious belief in order to identify a victim here. It's just a human person who suffers offense. Unlike God, whose attributes and even whose existence is disputed in pluralistic societies, human beings are possible holders of a valid moral claim not to suffer religious offense. Another reason to acknowledge that it's morally wrong to offend religious sensibilities of others refer to the particular character of this specific kind of offense. Feinberg distinguishes between offensive nuisances, which is referring to the senses, for example, if I smell something that is ugly or so, yeah. This is somehow something which is entirely different from this profound offense, which is referring to religious sensibilities. Profound offense, according to Feinberg, can be traced back to the person's higher order sensibilities, so to something which is essential to his or her identity. And this is something which is, as the person is, as it were, hit into his or her heart, as opposed to rather superficially scratched or so, like it is in offensive noises. So to cause such serious forms of offense could be considered a morally bad thing that should be avoided, in my view. On the other hand, there are also objections to this argument against such a moral claim not to have one's religious sensibilities offended, and I want to address two of these objections. The first objection points out that offense is a subjective condition in the sense that it depends on particular beliefs or values that are important to the person in question. Yeah? So take, for example, Andres Serrano's art piece, Piss Christ, as an example. A photograph of a crucifix that is submerged in a glass of urine. We can easily imagine that pious Christians are really seriously and profoundly offended by such an art piece. Others, however, who consider religion in general or Christianity in particular a rather outmoded and irrational phenomenon, will probably not be offended by such an art piece, right? So what causes offense to one's religious sensibilities is again strongly dependent on one's religious beliefs or one's attitudes or values, religious values. And because of this dependency, religiously offensive acts cannot be assessed morally wrong without privileging certain views, certain religious views against others. Yeah? It's easy to imagine to say that I'm suffering offense if a woman performs certain religious rituals. Yeah? Since I'm a member of, given that I'm a member of a patriarchal religion or so, then I'm feeling this offense seriously. Yeah? And nevertheless, we can say, okay, but it's part of her religion to perform a religious act. So it's not possible, in my view, to claim that there is a claim of not to be offended in one's religious sensibilities within this normative framework of my analysis. The second, quite interesting but nevertheless somehow problematic reason against considering religiously offensive speech, because of this offensiveness, says that believers can even benefit from such expressions despite of, or rather because of their offensiveness. And therefore, such acts shouldn't be assessed morally wrong. So how can we understand such a claim? At least within some religions, religious knowledge is considered fallible. And the same applies to religious beliefs and values. Because of this, even the most fundamental beliefs have been constantly reinterpreted and submitted to critical reassessment, to critical scrutiny throughout the history of religion. This process has often been fostered by acts that were at that time perceived as profoundly offensive. Such acts can, as it were, irritate and unsettle even those religious beliefs that have been acquired unconsciously by the person affected, and by this, such believers are challenged to reconsider, to critically reflect on their religious beliefs and traditions, and additionally also to grapple with religious beliefs they are confronted with in their social environment. And as a consequence of this, believers will either acquire a deeper understanding of their religion, they will consciously and explicitly reaffirm their beliefs, or they will possibly revise and partially modify their religious beliefs and practices. This argument can be traced back to John Stuart Mill's argument for freedom of expression, at least partially. However, this view, it's really an interesting view in my view, that certain instances of religiously offensive speech can be considered desirable instead of morally problematic. This is not without problems in my view. It presupposes, for example, a specific understanding of religion according to which it's not only allowed, but even desirable to critically assess one's religious beliefs. Yeah? Such a view is, in my view, quite adequate for many religions, but it doesn't go without saying that all religions fit into this model. And more importantly, it's a theological presumption, in the sense that it cannot be morally required by a person to critically assess, to constantly critically reflect upon one's religious beliefs. It may be wise to do so, and it may even be possible to formulate and justify a religious virtue that includes such a reiterated critical reflection upon one's religious beliefs. But such a virtue is not a moral or civic virtue, but rather a religious one, and this cannot be presupposed in an ethical analysis, therefore. So let me recapitulate briefly the argument from offense. This argument provides a reason to consider blasphemy morally significant and not merely a matter of religious orthodoxy. However, since a claim not to suffer offense of one's religious sensibilities cannot be justified, especially because of the first objection, the argument does not show, in my view, that blasphemy is to be considered morally wrong. The next argument I want to consider takes again a different perspective. I will call it the argument from exclusion. You can also call it the argument from racism, or the damaged status argument, for example. This argument takes, in the version that I will provide here, takes the right to freedom of religion, and equally important, the moral claim to social inclusion and to complete and full citizenship as normative points of reference. So this argument claims that particular instances of blasphemy create and foster a social atmosphere where believers run the risk of being socially damaged or in their status or socially excluded and lowered in the eyes of their fellow citizens if they publicly act upon their religious beliefs. This would be an indirect but nevertheless significant violation of the right to freedom of religion and the claim to social inclusion, and therefore it would be morally wrong. Again, let me take a closer look at this argument. First, we need to consider the relevant normative claims, namely freedom of religion on the one side and the claim to social inclusion on the other. To understand the purpose of freedom of religion, I would like to turn to considerations by Jürgen Habermas in the following. Habermas points out that human persons are substantially and necessarily culturally constituted, as he calls it. Human beings become persons not as isolated individuals, but always as members of particular communities and in interactions with other peoples, and in interactions with shared practices, traditions, values, and so on. This intrinsic significance of culture, as Habermas calls it, this continues through lifetime. It's not only relevant in the early childhood, but also later on. Traditions, values, narratives, and so on, this form a network within which a person forms and maintains and articulates, also publicly expresses her personal identity. For many people, this network is characterized by explicitly religious practices, narratives, and traditions. These elements are decisive for the identity of this person. Against this background, we can understand now the purpose of the right to freedom of religion. It is, according to Habermas, to guarantee all citizens equal access to those associations, traditions, and practices, to those networks, which they deem important in order to develop and maintain their personal identities. Freedom of religion is to be seen as a subjective right, therefore. It is designed for the purpose of protecting one's identity and the integrity of individuals in a particular social context, and for granting full social inclusion. So let us consider now, what does this mean? Full social inclusion or full citizenship. Drawing on considerations of philosophers like Anna Elisabetta Galliotti, Iris Marion Young, Nancy Fraser, and again Jürgen Habermas, I will understand full social inclusion or full citizenship as a status that allows people to participate as peers in the social life of the societies they are a member of. It's a status that allows people to participate as peers in the social life. Such participatory parity, as Fraser calls it, it presupposes that the person in question does not experience disregard or marginalization depending on membership in a group which is considered as inferior or something like this according to prevailing standards. Otherwise, so if a person would be considered as inferior because of membership in a particular group, such a person may formally enjoy all the rights that belong to citizenship, but it's not possible for the person to make use of these rights then, without being lowered in the eyes of the others or without having one's social status damaged. Both freedom of religion and the claim to full social inclusion can be considered valid moral claims within the normative framework of my analysis, since they are independent on particular religious beliefs. You don't have to be a believer in order to understand the purpose of and the relevance of the right to freedom of religion. Actually, Habermas conceptualizes cultural rights in exactly the same way. If we take both together, freedom of religion and social inclusion, there is a moral claim to form, maintain, and publicly express one's religious identity without losing the status of a fully included citizen of a society. So this is where the argument against particular instances of blasphemy ties in now, the argument from exclusion. Such acts do not only vilify God, which is the basis of the argument for blasphemy, and they do not only offend religious sensibilities of believers, the basis of the second argument, the argument for offense, but they can also be taken as representations of those believers whose God or whose religious beliefs are publicly vilified. And because of this, such expressions can serve as powerful tools to help to construct negative images or even stereotypes of the believers who are affected by the blasphemous utterances. This is especially relevant in view of the social inclusion of vulnerable religious minorities. Authors like Tariq Maloud, who developed this argument, he points out that in Western European societies, the social status of Muslims is very often low, and that they suffer social and economic marginality. Furthermore, and I think this is quite an important claim, Muslims are often perceived as the most relevant others in particular situations in the society, and as a threat to a liberal and predominantly secular society. In such a situation, utterances which can legitimately be described as blasphemous from the perspective of a particular religious community also become racist. Racist in the sense that they essentialize an entire group of people based on a particular part of their identity, and they classify this group as dangerous or inferior. From this angle, the problem of particular instances of, examples of blasphemy is not that God and his honor is publicly desecrated, and it's not that the religious sensibilities of a group of believers is offended. It's rather that blasphemy fosters the negative stereotyping of a religious group, the members of which already are in an especially vulnerable situation. The affected believers can be indirectly, but nevertheless effectively lowered in the eyes of the others. And this shift in the perspective is quite important. In the first perspective, it's as it were from God's perspective, right? The second argument says that it's from the perspective of the believer, what he or she experiences in his religious sensibilities. But the third argument says it's not important what I feel, important is what others think about me as a believer. And if blasphemous utterances contribute to having me lowered in the eyes of the others, then this is morally problematic or even morally wrong. From the perspective of freedom of religion, the problem is that when religious beliefs are publicly degraded and ridiculed without this being considered morally wrong, the social climate can make it unjustly costly for the affected believers to publicly express their identities. So, costly, what does it mean? People could feel impelled to refrain from exercising their freedom of religion because they fear the disdain of others and other socially damaging consequences. So the price, as it were, is the disdain of others or socially damaging consequences, the price of exercising one's liberty of religion. Such a reduction of the de facto possibility to make use of one's right to freedom of expression would have to be evaluated as morally wrong. So let me evaluate this argument from exclusion briefly. I already said that both claims to freedom of religion and the claim to social inclusion are valid moral claims in the sense that I defined in the beginning. Justification thereof is not dependent on particular religious beliefs. The further strength of this argument is that it's not dependent on the subjective perspective of religious believers who are affected by utterance. It's not important what I feel in this argument as a believer, but what others think about me. This strength, however, leads me to possible limitations or specific features of this argument. First, it should be noticed that it's not an argument against blasphemy as such. Rather, it claims that particular instances of blasphemous acts serve as tools that foster the social atmosphere of the social exclusion of affected believers, and are for these reasons morally wrong. However, it's not an intrinsic feature of blasphemy to foster such social exclusion, and this has, of course, important consequences for the scope of its argument. It says, the argument shows, that blasphemy is morally wrong if, but only if, it fosters social exclusion. A second important aspect of this argument from exclusion concerns the fact that context matters enormously here, even more than in the case of the second argument in my view. The power of an act to actually foster social exclusion depends largely upon factors like, for example, the person or the institution who utters it, the kind of authority who says it, yeah? The form of the utterance, and also the way it is presented. The impact of art pieces, for example, which are identifiable and presented as such, for example in a museum, will be significantly different from that of columns written by a well-known and socially recognized writer and published in widespread newspapers that claim to represent the voice of the people. Not to speak of publicly announced and widely spread utterance of political representatives. Furthermore, I already mentioned that the argument addresses acts that affect members of socially marginalized religious groups who are already especially vulnerable with regard to social exclusion. Hence, the argument says that it can be morally wrong to vilify the God or religious beliefs of those people who are in such a vulnerable situation, but this does also imply that one and the same blasphemous utterance is to be evaluated morally differently when the affected religious group is no longer in such a vulnerable situation, but socially well established. Yeah? This is quite important argument in my view if we consider the impact of, for example, Salman Rushdie's satanic practices in one particular society where Muslims are highly vulnerable or in a different social context. So it needs to be evaluated differently now. Whether there are blasphemous acts that significantly contribute to social exclusion and the hindrance of freedom of religion needs to be investigated empirically, of course. I cannot go into this here, since I'm not a social scientist, but Tariq Madood's studies provide some evidence for this. So obviously there is a sort of really powerful impact of such utterances. But nevertheless, it's to be expected there are only a few instances when blasphemy can have such an excluding and socially damaging effect. Even then, in my view, it's primarily the external circumstances that should be evaluated as morally wrong or as unjust. It's the environment that condemns those people whose religious beliefs are publicly vilified, that condemns these people to an extremely vulnerable position in society. Nevertheless, we have to admit or to concede that blasphemy can be considered morally wrong insofar as it contributes to this exclusion. At this point, however, it's necessary to widen the scope of the analysis, and I will at least address this but very brief and sketchy. Until now, I've been considering only blasphemous acts as such as it were. But the exclusionary power is not limited to such acts. Rather, I argue this exclusionary power primarily takes effect in the subsequent public controversy that encompasses both protests against blasphemous acts and public responses to such protests. In the case of the Muhammad cartoons, both the protests and public responses to the protests were very diverse. I'm more interested in the responses to the protests here. Many people publicly expressed their solidarity with either the newspaper or the believers, and even more people, including many Muslims, condemned violent reactions against the publication of the cartoons. Furthermore, there have been voices, quite influential voices, that generally labeled the protesters as illiberal religious fundamentalists who were not able or not willing to understand the basic principles of democratic societies and to act accordingly. In my view, there are, for example, contributions by Hirsi Ali who go in this direction, and also Fleming Rose, the cultural editor of US Post, contributed in a way like this to the debate. Such contributions implicitly presuppose and explicitly and effectively construct and communicate what Bert van den Brink, my colleague at the Department of Philosophy, calls informal conceptions of democratic life. Culturally dominant informal conceptions of democratic life predetermine who is recognized as competent or as incompetent a citizen, and they also influence dominant grammar of public debate that determines what passes as possibly valuable contribution or what is filtered out, for example, as expression of anti-democratic attitudes. In this way, the form of public controversy about blasphemy strongly influences the exclusionary power of blasphemous utterances. In extreme cases, believers could not only be stereotyped and lowered in the eyes of their fellow citizens, but also made voiceless and hence effectively excluded from public debate about acts that matter strongly to them. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Catherine McKinnon's book Only Words, in which she discusses the silencing effects of pornography and on women's speech acts against such pornography. And there is a sort of point of contact of her contribution with my argument here. In terms of McKinnon's theory, we could say that there could be an illocutionary disablement of believers. In such cases, the felicity conditions for believers' protest are set by influential contributions of people who are considered authoritative speakers and who label the protests of believers generally in terms of anti-democratic and illiberal religious zealousness. So it's more or less impossible for the protesters to make their point or to articulate their protests, since the environment for the reception of their protests is influenced from the outset in a way that everybody hears only or almost only anti-democratic attitudes, whereas they just want to contribute to public debate. Taking these considerations into account, I argue that except for some extreme cases that shape into cultural racism, blasphemous acts as such are not to be evaluated morally wrong. I cannot see that, for example, the public exhibition of art pieces like Serrano's Peace Christ or the pop singer Madonna's Crucifixion act on stage violate a valid moral claim. And the same applies for Hirsi Ali and Theo van Gogh's movie Submission, or for Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses. Hence, it's not the artist or the curator of an exhibition who is the holder of a moral obligation to treat religious beliefs of others respectfully. Accordingly, he or she is not to be morally blamed if his or her work possibly causes offense to religious sensibilities. But again, this does not apply to acts that immediately result in social exclusion. In this case, I would argue that they are to be blamed. However, if I am right that a possible exclusionary effect of blasphemous acts take effect in public debate about such acts, then this provides reasons for a moral obligation not to contribute to the construction and the communication of anti-religious informal conceptions of democratic life that make protesting believers appear anti-democratic fundamentalists. I even consider it as part of civic virtue to watch over the dominant informal conceptions of democratic life. This again includes that it's praiseworthy in a specific moral sense to intervene in public debate in order to prevent unjust informal conceptions of democratic life and to criticize people or political parties and other organizations that foster informal but effective social exclusion. And against this background, the remedy that I propose against possibly morally problematic aspects of blasphemous acts is not restrictions of free speech, but more speech, namely a critique against any unjust framing of problems concerning blasphemy in public debate. However, at this point I have to admit that the normative framework of my analysis is not sufficient to determine the normative status of such a civic virtue and the moral praiseworthiness of public interventions against the construction of certain informal conceptions of moral life. I do have some suggestions concerning this, but I would propose that we can keep this for the discussion. For the time being, I would like to thank you very much for your time.